Welcome to Frank and Friends. In this episode, we're going to be talking with Professor Jack Shannon, who's Professor of Legal Studies at Seton Hall University, and Frank Diana, who's the Managing Partner and Futurist at TCS. I'm your moderator, Kevin Benedict, also a partner and futurist at TCS. Again, welcome and thank all of you guys for joining us today. So if I got this right now, both Frank and Jack, you both attended a recent online event called the Future of Children. Talk to us about that. Frank, let's start with you. What did you learn? And you were also a speaker there, and you won some kind of prize for speaking there. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a prize. It was actually an interesting session. They did a Shark Tank format. Three folks came up with big ideas around education and its future, and I won that piece, which was interesting, mind you, but it really just was focused on children. The organization is a nonprofit called Children at Risk, and so obviously given the title, they're focused on, the future of children and what specifically education might look like. So what interests me, obviously, is anything future-oriented, but in this case, as Jack knows, I'm a big believer that education lies at the heart of this massive transition and transformation we're going to be going through, as it has been throughout history. Education has always bridged the gap between eras, and I don't see this being anything different. And so it was interesting to me to listen to some of the key speakers in that event. Jack, what were your thoughts?
Well, Frank, I agree with you. You and I are on the same page in terms of education and the impact it can have on either obstructing this change or facilitating it. And one of the things that I thought as a result of that particular presentation, it opened with Bob Sanborn and Alex Whittington talking about some forecasts that they had done back in 2005. I think they published the paper. When you think about, they talked about that long ago and how close to the mark they were now here in 2020, it's really pretty remarkable. And it's not even driven by the pandemic. What they were talking about didn't anticipate an accelerating event like the pandemic. So, when I look at this, when you think about the incredible change that we're in the midst of, and it's getting faster and faster, I thought that whole session, from the discussion of architecture, we often don't think about architecture as critical to learning. We now have to. So I think it touched on a lot of different topics. I think your segment of that was, frankly, particularly on point because for me, you looked at it from the broadest possible perspective and put education as the central element to that. And I think that's really critical.
Frank, talk to us about give us your notes. What did you speak about there?
Well, so as I mentioned, I started with, to position this big idea. As I mentioned, education really having been central to the mid-1850s transition from child labor to steam really driving the machinery. And so educating a skilled workforce to run those machines was critical to moving from a 40-year period of really dystopian misery for workers to a period of prosperity. And then again, at the early stages of the second revolution, how we moved from the farm to the factory and the office, and high school was the invention, if you will, that really enabled us to transition again from that period. So the big idea really is, if you buy into this notion that this coming period will probably be more transformative than those were, then what role does education play in parting the bridge between today and that world? And so the big idea was a change in how we think about learning and education, not just putting Band-Aids on maybe a broken process, but rethinking completely what it means to learn and what it means to educate not just our children, but ourselves. And if you think about it at that level, then you start asking questions like, information is abundant. Is dumping information into someone's brain the real outcome we're looking for as far as education? Or are we looking to educate in the context of new skill sets, new characteristics, the humanness that makes us who we are, and nurturing those things as opposed to information dumps?
Yeah, I know when I looked over your notes from your presentation there, Frank, a lot of those areas of education that you think maybe become more valuable in the future are kind of soft skills, aren't they?
Mostly soft skills. I mean, things like creativity and empathy and entrepreneurial spirit and collaborative capability and just the interpersonal dynamics that we know become more and more important in a world where we're hiding behind screens, right? How does the future human act in a world where technology is taken over to a large degree, and we have to rely on those softer skills to really function in society. And I don't think personally that education systems have been really good at that piece of it.
That your position there is not obvious in the beginning. When I look at it, it seems like a world filled with technology would be much more engineering and mathematics and logic and all these kinds of hard sciences focus, but you're talking about skills that you almost give up the technology space to robots and come back to, what do we need to be as humans?
Yeah, I'll comment, and I'm interested in Jack's thoughts on this, given that he's dealing with this day to day. If you think about the period that's coming, and I just wrote about this morning, there's a transition period that moves us from where we are to where we will be. In the where we are phase, that technology skills and STEM and all those things are critically important, right? The example I used this morning was there's a driverless service now in Arizona, real live service in Arizona, and they're going to need people to monitor those cars. So workers with skill sets to monitor cars, but eventually algorithms take over for those workers. So the period between now and then is a prosperous period if we enable that prosperity, like supporting Green New Deals and infrastructure and those kinds of things. When we get to the other side, that's when the human challenge is going to be faced. But we have the opportunity, knowing that, to manage this transition, right? And education is just one big piece of that management. Jack, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, Frank. You know that I've been telling my students for a long time that they have to be the most flexible, adaptable, imaginative, and resilient people in the room. And some of that is subject matter knowledge, but they've grown up. Think of my typical undergraduate. They've never lived without a screen. And if they have a question, they pull out their mobile and they ask their mobile, whether that's via typing in some text or speaking. I started shifting a long time ago to less about, have you memorized this and can you regurgitate it, to helping them understand conceptually what we were talking about. What's the context? Why are we in this position? Because as long as they can remember some facts, they can they can go back and search it and find more detail and fill in the blanks. But if they don't understand it in its own context, then their judgment. It's that, the answers are easy. I mean, we can find answers to everything. It's the questions that are hard. And we're not helping these young people really learn how to ask the right questions. So, I would suggest that when we start moving deeper into the transition you're describing, Frank, I think that what I describe as a translator becomes more important. The person that can actually help others translate the technology and its impact and its influence, whether that's in synthetic biology or autonomous vehicles or finding ways to augment the human form so that we can help Elon get to Mars. To me, the person who is able to straddle both worlds or multiple worlds are going to be the truly valuable folks, and they're going to be hard to come by.
Yeah, no, I agree. And interesting, just Kevin, Jack, to go back to that future of children session. One of the person presenting in the Chart Tech piece of the event was focused on a high school that she was part of in Texas, where they were eliminating the grading system. And so she was actually tangibly trying to deploy some of the things that I was talking about. And what I found interesting was in eliminating the grading system, they find much more student engagement, much more empathy, just a passion, an ability to focus on areas of their interest. That just eliminating the grading system started to really enhance the education outcomes. And isn't that what this is all about, right? Enhancing the education outcome.
Let's talk about the purpose of education. Is it to look ahead and say, what's the future of work, and then prepare our students for that? Or is the challenge really to make us better humans?
Yeah, I think the critical factor, and Kevin, you gave me the perfect segue. I think we've lost sight of why we have education. A college education was once an elite opportunity. It was the wealthy who could take advantage of it. And the goal was to prepare them to become good citizens, however we want to define that. And as we've democratized education over the years, to Frank's earlier point, we mandated high school education earlier than most of the world. And so therefore our population, our citizens, were better prepared for the Industrial Revolution than many other places. Democratize higher ed, and suddenly you're opening the door to the middle class, you're giving them opportunity, you're providing them with insight they might not otherwise have had. But what we've managed to do is also, over time, kind of skew that toward a skill set that gets you a job. We've diminished the importance of the humanities. I'm a business school professor. I was a dean of a business school. But I think the humanities are arguably the most important thing you can take away, because without those, you have literally a gap in being prepared to do those things that Frank's describing as the soft skills. And so from my perspective, what we don't want to do is lose sight of the fact that the reason we've let these young people who are really well prepared wander around in a park with a lot of smart people for 4 years and come out with a credential is not just about whether or not you can read a balance sheet or you can prepare a marketing plan, because those are fungible bits of knowledge. The financial statement is going to be prepared and analyzed by an algorithm, at least, if not a broader AI. So you're the one, as the human, again, you have to be the one that translates that. And if you don't have those human skills, if you are not in a position to be able to move that agenda, you can't translate. You're going to find yourself replaced by something that can do it faster and probably substantially better.
Yeah, no, I agree. So two points. One, on the notion of what are the education outcomes we're looking for? What is education? And you said, Jack, getting our good citizens, right? And we lost sight of that. But I would say that enabling a human to function in the society that is versus this, or will be, versus the society that was. And I think the fundamental flaw in our current education system is aimed at a society that was. And we've clearly moved on from that society, and we'll take a step function leap again into a world that looks very different. And so at the core of it, I think, education, and again, it's not just children, it's all of us. It has to be enabling us to function in a society that's emerging. And to your point, Kevin, understanding what that society might look like then becomes critical, because we have to understand what we're aiming for before we can aim for it. So obviously that role of Futurist becomes even more critical. And then the second, I wanted to react, Jack, to your notion of higher education. Interesting facts around MBAs and just how much they might have undermined us as opposed to helping us. There's some great stats around very few MBAs in Silicon Valley companies where you find your innovation hubs. You don't find a lot of MBAs, and that we've done a disservice by focusing them strictly on shareholder value, managing a balance sheet, as you said, right? The kinds of things that they end up in the finance world more than any world outside of that. So the question is, what becomes of that? I mean, from an MBA higher education perspective, how does that evolve in terms of the things we're talking about? Any thoughts?
Well, yes, I do. I think that's a perfect example of something you alluded to earlier. We've automated the processes that existed. So we've basically automated everything we can think of. You threw a computer at it, or you threw some software at it. So, and when you think about it, in education, we never rethought how we learn and how we could develop a better process for learning. We've gone online, and what we've done basically is transition from a physical setting to a virtual setting, but we basically do much of the same thing. Not everywhere. I mean, there's plenty of innovation out there, but it hasn't gotten enough traction in the broader community yet to really make a difference. And I think the next phase of this, what you've referred to already, Frank, is I think we've got to go back and we have to, I don't want to call it automate, but we have to rethink the processes that underlie everything that we do, because we basically took the 12 steps that we did to do X, and we threw a computer at it, and we maybe designed some software, I'll give you an example. Higher ed, everybody has a learning management system. And that's the big boy is Blackboard, there's Canvas, there's a bunch of them. I've used several, but almost every one of them is designed to mimic what we used to do in a face-to-face classroom. So when these things were created years ago, they essentially took what we were doing and just put them inside a computer and then eventually moved them to the cloud. So, for instance, in my Blackboard class, you don't know what's going on unless you're in the class. So if you're in that Blackboard shell, now you know what's going on, but there's no good mechanism to provide alerts. So how do we address that? Well, for years I used Slack. I now use Teams as my communication collaboration platform. And you begin to transition away from those baked in tools. And at the moment, you're kind of pulling from here and pulling from there and making it up as you go along. And if I can, just one more, I went remote last March. Before we left for spring break, I put my students on Teams and on Zoom. And I said to them in the second week in March, I don't think I'm going to see you again this semester unless it's through a webcam. And of course, they all thought I was crazy. We came back for one day. I made sure everybody was set up. And the next time we met, it was in a synchronous environment like this. It wasn't terrific, largely because you miss that dynamism of being in the room. But I'm back to it again this semester. As I said to you earlier, Kevin, I set up a streaming studio in my office to provide a better experience for them and frankly for me as well. And every day that I deliver a synchronous learning environment over these platforms, I tweak it, I adjust, because I learn something new. So what we're doing, Frank, is we're adapting in real time. There's no template for this. The only template we had was, okay, do what you did in the classroom, but in front of a webcam. And so, what I'm learning every time I do this is that I've got to change the way I ask questions, or I have to update the way I present the content, or any number of other little nuances. But I still haven't had the time to really think through whether or not I can build a better learning environment that isn't based entirely at some level on what we've done since Aristotle.
Yeah, that I wanted to comment on that, and then actually I want to circle back to Kevin. That captures, I believe, what's happened across every industry. We use digital technologies, throw a computer at it, but basically digital has been an overlay on top of how we've always done things. So maybe you've driven a little productivity gain or a little efficiency, but you never rethought how we do things, because now the technology allows you to do so. And so I think the reason why this global phenomena of stalled productivity growth across the world is happening is because although digital's there, it's not being used the way it can be used to drive that productivity growth. And I think that's a common denominator across every industry. Kevin, I know you've been doing a number of these higher education-focused shows. Any common themes that are coming out of those, and any that relate to this conversation?
Oh, absolutely. It's a recognition of the gap to, all these universities had some basic technologies and infrastructures in place, from enrollment to ERPs, the facility management, and the blackboards out there. But if we're really going to be living in this kind of environment, how is education changing, just like all of us talked about? I mean, for example, you can take even a kindergartner or a first grader and second grader, and you can give them tests which will highlight how that particular and individual student learns better. Maybe it's a tactile environment. Maybe they hear and they can learn better hearing than reading. You can identify these kinds of learning requirements early, yet they never change the way the education is presented to that student during the course of their education. What if you could be tested early on, and every book, every subject, everything automatically, based on your testing, is presented to you in a unique and individualized way so you can learn at the best and optimized environment. I mean, that's what technology is for. That's personalization. That's user experience, yet we haven't taken any of that to education yet.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. I at least want to get one more thought out there. And Jack, I'd like your thoughts on this. Given that you've had to, so the pandemic has accelerated a couple things. One, our understanding of just how flawed the world is, and how this phenomena of pace was there already. The pandemic just shone a light on it. And two, it's forced us to accelerate the path towards things that were coming anyway. So you've had to deal with this since March. What are the biggest learnings you've had as far as the challenges of moving to a more virtual kind of learning environment? Any thoughts?
God, there's so many, Frank. It's really pretty remarkable. My students haven't had a snow day since 2008 because I've been using this technology even back then. So, and I've gone through Google Wave and Google Plus and Google this and Face. I mean, I was probably ready to go remote in March. What I wasn't ready for was moving from what everybody was comfortable with to an entirely different delivery modality permanently. So when we had a snow day in 2012, we missed a class or two, and everybody knew they were going to be back in a classroom on Monday. Once we made that transition out, one of the biggest questions my students had, Frank, was, Professor, when do you think this is going to be over? Are we going to be back in school in September? And, just by way of example, I was talking to one of my alums the other day, and he's got a kindergartner, and he said to me, my 5-year-old's in kindergarten. I said, wow, how's he doing? And he said, he's having the time of his life. And I said, really? I said, how's he adjusting? He said, he's in kindergarten. He has no idea what school's like if it's not in front of a screen. So he thinks this is terrific. Because Mom and I are always saying, get off that screen. Well, now he's doing it to go to school. And I think that was the challenge. I had issues. Some of my students would say to me, Professor, my parents think I'm not in school. And I had one mom who vacuumed the living room every time we were in class in the dining room. And, or, the younger sibling would blow through the door and interrupt, or, I had digital divide issues. I had some students that had no Wi-Fi at home, or found themselves effectively homeless, because it was like suddenly working remotely. Do I set up a little space over in the corner for my space, that sort of thing. But as a professor, that meant that I had to spend a good bit of time helping them work their way through what this was doing to their lives. So before class in the spring, it was 15 or 20 minutes of how's everybody doing? How's your families? I had some parents that were sick, and, et cetera. So, that was on the kind of personal level with the students. This was not something they were signed up for and suddenly they were faced with, and it had the potential to disrupt their college education. And in many cases, just grasp June. Professor, I heard we're going to have a vaccine in June. No. So that was on the how do you help your students through? From my perspective as the professor, it meant literally what I said earlier. I had to rethink what I was doing in real time. I had to adjust in real time. I could rethink before class, and then you have a bandwidth problem or a lag problem, or I'm sitting in front of, or standing now, thank God, in front of 3 screens. One of those screens is the streaming software that allows me to manage all this. So while I'm talking to my students, I'm also over here in the corner off to my left eye, managing the stream and setting up on this monitor what I'm going to show my students. And so that all of a sudden, Frank, I'm able to talk about juggling multiple balls, right? And then there's the preparation. We spent, and this was the good news, our Teaching, Learning, and Technology Center built a series of training sessions for the business faculty. And pretty much everybody went through them. And they also did a broader set for the entire faculty at the university. It was an emergency. We're not really great at this, but everybody spent the summer learning how to do this and getting better at it. So now pretty much everybody can competently do this. The problem is that, as we've said, Frank, we're doing what we did in a classroom, but with a webcam. We haven't rethought how we restructure a course, a learning environment. Do you need a 3-hour-a-week course, or could you do a series of Ask Me Anythings and shift more of the responsibility for the preparation, that old flip the classroom idea? From an industry experience, I think everybody is paying a lot of lip service to the impact that this is going to have on the industry, and they're not really coping with it.
Yeah, no, I can see that being the case. And just as we get to a close, it'd be a great idea for us to follow up and have another session, maybe in a month or so after you've had more experience under your belt, to just kind of circle back and see how things have evolved. It's Kevin, just back to you in terms of your closing thoughts.
Yeah, we talked about technology and we talked about, the future. But one of the things, going back to a question you asked earlier, Frank, is what have I learned? Is that is how important students find the university experience. And I'm sure, Jack, you intimately understand this, but I didn't recognize how both the parents and the students were looking forward to actual personal growth happening at a university, in a university environment, with a new set of coaches, mentors, professors, kind of challenging, guiding, and pointing the way for students, and how sitting in their parents' basement just doesn't cut it from a personal growth perspective. They can gain skills, they can memorize more content in the basement of their parents on a laptop, but can they experience that whole personal growth that everyone was really wanting to pay for? And that's something I just hadn't paid a lot of attention to. I think when I went to the university, I was already married and I was focused on getting a job, getting my degree and getting a job. But a lot of these are looking, 18-year-olds, parents are sending them away and paying a lot of money for the purpose of, they want the university to help transform these obstinate teenagers into self-sufficient, good citizens and adults when they come back. And they just don't know how that's going to be accomplished, or whether they want to pay that kind of top dollar if it's just skills that the kids are learning and not the whole personal transformation. So that's, I know, of course, a whole nother episode, but that was one of those big things. And then, in fact, how can technology help with or develop or expand that university type experience? Any closing thoughts, Jack?
I think we're looking at the early stages of what could be the unbundling of higher education, in much the same way that disruption has done that in other industries. The music model was 12 songs on a piece of vinyl, and it isn't anymore. In our case, I used to ask this question: do you really need a rock climbing wall to give someone a good education? And it turns out that it depends on, right back to that question you raised early, Kevin, it depends on what you're looking for. What's those outcomes? And if your outcomes are that we want you to come away, we want you to grow up, we want you to become socialized, we want you to build a network, we want you to have better communication skills, all that soft stuff that we've traditionally undervalued, then the college experience becomes really an important part of that. Can it be sustained in its current business model? Probably not. How much longer are people going to be willing to go into a lot of debt at $40,000 or $50,000 a year, when if all they want is a job, then they could do that in other ways? And so I think that, Frank, you're right, another conversation, because this is moving so fast. And we've already got a dozen colleges that have gone under, and I think that pressure is going to be on everyone. You think you're going to do well by implementing that typical traditional 5-year strategic plan, it's not going to work. Just not going to work.
Yeah, and so they're important because all these learnings, in this case education, help us kind of determine what paths might occur as this all plays out. So if I took this conversation to more of a macro level and said, rather than education, let's look at society as a whole. Kevin, your points around the experience and the personal transformation, and all these questions around, will remote work continue to be the way work is done in the future? And are humans built for that? Will we want to go back to the way it was? Those questions remain to be answered, but how they're answered determine the kind of society we all enjoy or realize in the next 10 years. And so going back to this topic, understanding more about what we've learned, I think it's just a microcosm of the bigger question. So I'd love to have another conversation.
Sure.
Perfect. And I would invite everyone out there that watches this, please subscribe so you can be first to know about new versions of this, new episodes from Frank and Friends and the Future of Business TV. I want to thank all of you for joining us today.